Hello, thanks for tuning in to the first episode of Esoteric Literacy. This is a show where we will be discussing all sorts of strange and interesting topics, ranging from UFOs to medieval philosophy to lesser-known aspects of science and history, and all kinds of interesting things that largely go ignored or are too controversial for mainstream academia to deal with. So I hope you'll find these videos very interesting and informative, and I hope you won't be offended by them, because a lot of this subject matter will challenge all of our worldviews. But hey, that's life. So this first episode, I figured we should start off with something kind of an overview of what esoteric thinking is, and who better to help us along with that than the great 20th century philosopher Rudolf Steiner. He's definitely my favorite philosopher. I've been studying his lectures and books for years now, and he has had a very big impact on me, and he's also had a big impact on the world. Rudolf Steiner, you may know him as the founder of the Waldorf schooling system. He is also the inventor of biodynamic farming, and he was a big influence to the spiritual and scientific thinking of the Western world since the late 19th century, actually. He was first involved with the Theosophical Society that was founded by Helena Blavatsky, and later headed by Annie Besant, but due to particular disagreements with Besant, Rudolf Steiner left, and his students left with him, and his students founded what is called the Anthroposophical Society, which was his own philosophical scientific movement, or rather is like a lecture circuit teaching his spiritual science, reporting on his clairvoyant research, and teaching art, architecture, and agricultural techniques. He has left an immensely beneficial legacy to the human race and a wealth of lectures and written knowledge. He wrote, I think, 7 or 8 books, which doesn't sound like that many, but he gave more than 6,000 lectures, which are published in books, or you can read them at rsarchive.org. There'll be a link in the description. So, esoteric thinking, exoteric thinking, these are the two kinds of thinking a human being can experience. Esoteric comes from the Greek root eso, which means inner. So esoteric thinking is when your soul moves in toward the spirit and all the perceptions regarding that inner nature. Exoteric thinking, on the other hand, is when the soul moves outward toward the external world. That is when you engage your 5 senses, your hearing, your sight, your smell, your taste, and your touch, and you engage your environment and you detect information from your environment through these 5 bodily senses. That is exoteric thinking or exoteric perception. So esoteric thinking is largely ignored in our modern world, and I would like to take this lecture to describe why esoteric thinking is largely ignored. And this has to do with the development of consciousness over time, since the beginning of the world, and how we got to this point. Now, these ideas are going to be controversial to scientists who have their cosmology and their belief in where the earth came from, and to orthodox religious thinkers who have their belief in what the world is and where it came from. So please, I urge you not to argue or debate in the comments section, because we all went to school, we all went to church, we know what the scientists think, and we know what the priests think. So please keep those arguments to yourself. I am not sharing my opinions. These are the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. They're not my teachings. So please do not attempt to persuade me of anything, because I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. I'm merely reporting on what this philosopher taught in the early 20th century. And that's all. It's just something to ponder. I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm not trying to shock anyone. I'm not trying to change the way you think or what you believe. I'm just going to offer you something to ponder. So the first thing I'm going to describe that Rudolf Steiner taught is the makeup of the human being. Now, most people are very familiar with the physical body. Our bones, our blood, our flesh, our nervous system, and so on. This is an obvious part of what the human being is. Modern scientists believe it to be the only part of what the human being is. Modern scientists, of course, believe that the mind and consciousness and emotions and all of that stuff are just coming from the physical body. They think that chemical reactions and electronic impulses through the nervous system create consciousness and emotions and this sort of thing. I'm here to tell you that that probably isn't true, at least according to esoteric thinking. It's definitely not true. So the body is just a lesser part of the human being, and the human being is also composed of what is known as the ether body, the astral body, and the I. These four components make up the complete human being as it is currently at our current state of evolution. Now, in future states of evolution, there will be spiritual bodies that are higher than the I, that we will develop in the future. But for right now, we are made up of these four entities, the I being the highest so far, then the astral, then the ether, then the physical. So we're all pretty familiar with the physical body. We all have one. But the ether body is a little more subtle. Some people call it the subtle body. Yogis will call it the light body. Alchemists will call it the vegetable body. That sounds a little misleading, but it is because the ether body is responsible for the autonomic functions of the physical body. That includes digestion. That's where they get vegetable body from, because it vegetates out the physical body. After you consume some food, the ether body goes to work digesting that food and turning it into the physical body. So the ether body is responsible basically for creating and regulating the physical body. It's what makes your blood pump, it's what helps you breathe and blink. You know, you don't have to think about these autonomic things, they just sort of happen. It's because your ether body is controlling those things. Well, actually, higher spiritual beings in the cosmic hierarchy are controlling these things through the ether body. I'll describe that in a moment. Then a little bit higher than the ether body, you have the astral body. This is where your desires and emotions originate, and it is very much animalistic. At least you can think of the astral body as sort of divided into two. You have a lower astral and a higher astral. And the lower astral is primarily where our animalistic nature comes from. Our desire to fight, to eat, to procreate, or not procreate, depending on your mood. And those sorts of animalistic things are, instinct and that sort of stuff are lower astral. And then the higher astral is a little bit more human. It's a little bit more self-controlled. That's more where the intellectual aspects originate. That's kind of where thoughts begin to show up. Then above the astral body, you have the I, which is the ego with a capital E. Now, Rudolf Steiner uses ego very much differently than how Freud and the New Agers use ego. Now, Freud and the New Agers, in my opinion, just made up a bunch of crap because, that's what they do. They just sort of sit around and think of stuff, and just because they thought of it, they think it's true. I really don't like Freud. I think he was kind of stupid. And he misrepresents the ego. He kind of just made up this idea that the ego is like what I just described as a lower astral. New Agers and Freudians will call that the ego. What the lower astral does, they'll consider it the ego. But honestly, in my opinion, we should just strike that word from our mind, or just at least what Freud and the New Agers say about the ego. Like, the ego should be dissolved, the ego should be destroyed, or the ego should be controlled. All this stuff, that's a completely inappropriate way of thinking about the ego. You can think about the ego as the I, the higher self, what those New Agers would call the higher self. That's actually the ego. That's where your personality originates. And it is the highest aspect of our spiritual nature that we have evolved so far, according to Steiner. Again, All of these things are according to Rudolf Steiner, in this video at least. So that is Steiner's way of thinking about the ego. It's the higher self. It is not this lower thing that needs to be controlled or dismantled or whatever. That is a very New Agey, weird Freudian way of thinking of things. So that's the 4 parts of the human being, or if you consider the division of the astral, sort of 5-ish parts of what make up a modern human. And the humans, obviously, according to Rudolf Steiner and Johannes Trithemius, make up the lowest level of the cosmic hierarchy. Now, I'll describe what the cosmic hierarchy is according to Steiner and Trithemius, and according to Christians and Muslims and Jews. And in a roundabout way, also according to Zoroastrians and Hindus. They all pretty much agree on what this cosmic hierarchy is, humans being at the lowest level of it. Just above the humans, you have, of course, the angels. These Steiner calls the children of life. Above the angels, you have archangels. Steiner calls them the spirits of fire. Above them, you have the principalities, or what you can call archons. They are the spirits of personality. Above them, you have the powers, or what the Jews would call the Elohim. These are the spirits of form. And now I know that's very controversial. I just use the word Elohim to describe one of the lower stages of the cosmic hierarchy, when some Orthodox religious people will consider Elohim to be God, the Most High. In Steiner's opinion, the Elohim is not God the Most High, but is one of the lower stages of the hierarchy, part of what are called the spirits of form. Above the Elohim, or also known as the powers, you have the mites, or the dynamis, as the Greeks would call them, the spirits of motion. Above them, you have the dominions, who are the spirits of wisdom. Above them, you have the thrones, who are the spirits of will. Above them, you have the cherubim, the spirits of harmony. Above them, you have the seraphim, or the spirits of love. And then, of course, on top of all that, you have the Most High, God, or Tao, as the Taoists would call it. So that's the cosmic hierarchy according to Steiner, Johann Trithemius, and a few other philosophers throughout time. And take it or leave it, believe it or don't, it's not my concern, but it is what they teach. And it makes a lot of sense in an esoteric way. If you can absorb that knowledge, make it a part of your thinking, a lot of things begin to make sense. But again, that is for you to do. And I'm not encouraging a radical overhaul of your beliefs. I personally don't care what you believe. I believe in freedom of thought, so have fun with it. Now, considering the cosmic hierarchy, we can now consider the stages of development of the Earth itself, kind of how we got here according to Rudolf Steiner. Now, Rudolf Steiner was capable of clairvoyant research, what he would call spiritual scientific research. And he had this talent since he was a little kid. He could see what other people cannot. He can see into the spiritual or invisible dimension of life. And he could also see into what is called the Akashic record by the Hindus. The Hindus call it Akasha. Sort of New Agers, theosophers kind of took it and called it Akashic record, sort of anglicized or Latinized the word, put the word record at the end of it. And this is sort of like the history of the cosmos. It's sort of like everything that happens gets recorded on this layer of reality, and in a certain state of consciousness, you can look through the historical record, this Akashic record, and see into the past. And Rudolf Steiner did this quite often. Similar to Edgar Cayce, Rudolf Steiner reported on Atlantis and what the Atlanteans were like and how that disaster happened and all of that. I'll do a whole episode on Atlantis in the future. But he also went even further back than that to how the Earth developed. And again, please leave your arguments and debate in your head where they belong. I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. This is just what Rudolf Steiner reports from his clairvoyant research. Now the first stage, he named these stages of Earth evolution after the planets just because it was convenient. They don't really have anything to do with the planets. Like the first stage of evolution was called the Saturn stage. It doesn't have anything to do with Saturn. It's just what he called these stages of evolution, I guess for organization's sake, or perhaps for some symbolic reason that's a little bit deeper. But the names aren't really that important. He just named them after planets. Now the first stage is called the Saturn stage. And at this point, the Earth had no material composition whatsoever. You could think of it like a giant ball of warmth in space. If you could imagine warmth without fire, without light, just the nature of warmth itself. You could, like if you're flying in a spaceship and you came up onto the Earth, you wouldn't see anything, but if you flew into it, you would then feel warmth and, maybe various degrees of warmth in different areas of this big sphere that was roughly the size of the Earth as it is today, maybe a little bit bigger. And humans at this stage, there were humans, but they're not like humans that we think of today, like, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a physical body. Humans, or the spirits of humans, existed, and they were only composed of the astral body and the eye. They did not have an ether body or a physical body at that point. Just the astral body and the eye. So you can imagine this sort of nebulous, more spiritual entity existing in a big sphere of warmth out in the middle of space. The second stage of evolution for the Earth was called the Sun. Again, it doesn't have anything to do with the sun. This is just a name for the stage of evolution. And this is when a sort of atmospheric condition entered into the ball of warmth. I have to point out that between each stage, the Earth is absorbed in what the Hindus would call a pralaya, which is the Earth is taken out of material existence and reabsorbed into the spiritual world for a time. And then it will reemerge back into material existence in a new stage of evolution. So between every stage of evolution there is a pralaya, or a period of time where the Earth itself actually doesn't exist in a material way. It only exists in a spiritual way, where it is then prepared for its next material manifestation. So, the giant ball of warmth was absorbed into the spiritual world, and then when it came back out during the sun period of evolution, it had an atmospheric component on top of the warmth component. So now it was kind of this swirling ball of air and warmth. And the entities at that time, the human beings, as we could call them, the spirits of humans, then developed the ether body. So they were now composed of an ether body, an astral body, and an eye. They evolved for a time. The Earth was swallowed back up by the spiritual world, where it was prepared for the moon phase when it came back into material manifestation. It was called the moon phase, according to Rudolf Steiner. And there was a sort of liquid component now added. So warmth, water, and liquid. And the human beings at that time then began the first semblances of what would be the physical body. It was kind of an amorphous, blobby thing that wouldn't hold on to any particular shape. It would look like this animal, then morph into a human-looking thing, then morph into something else, and it couldn't really keep its shape, except the most spiritually advanced and evolved human beings at that time were able to sort of maintain most of the time a relatively human-looking shape out of this liquid medium. So you could immediately tell who the most advanced people were because they looked generally like a human. They had like 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head and a torso kind of a thing going on. But it was still, made out of like this fluid that was suspended in an atmosphere of fluid and air. And there was still no mineral components in the Earth at this time. So then the moon phase of the Earth gets reabsorbed in the spiritual world, and then the Earth phase comes out. This is the phase we're in right now. Steiner calls it the Earth phase, and this is when the material component of the world came about, and the human beings then now have a solid physical body, material body, a mineral body. Our bodies are made up of mineral. We're made up of, carbon and copper and zinc and all of these minerals that compose the human being. So this is the stage that we are in currently. And this is the only stage that scientists recognize. They believe that the universe was always mineral, and that the Earth was collected by clumps of dust and rock, and that's how the Earth came to be. That is the orthodox dogma of science. And, that is what it is. That's what they think. That's what they've discovered through geology and astrophysics. But again, these are just theories anyway. They've not been sufficiently proven. Rudolf Steiner is a clairvoyant who claims he could actually see into the past of how this happened. Scientists generally don't have that capability. And so it's up to you. Who do you think is more correct? The theories of materialistic scientists or the theories of a clairvoyant scientist? Again, do your own research. Now, Steiner mentions that there will be 3 more phases of earthly and human evolution in the future, before humans then are kicked up one step higher in the cosmic hierarchy, whatever that means. It's not that we're going to replace angels, it's just that we're going to become like them or something, and then another stage lower than us is going to come into existence. And then the cosmic hierarchy, instead of having 9 or 10 steps, will have like 10 or 11 steps. So the 3 phases for the future, Steiner calls the Jupiter phase, which is next, the Venus phase, and then followed lastly by the Vulcan phase. He never really described what these phases would contain, what they would be like. But he did hint a little bit at what the Jupiter phase would be like, because if you've been following, you can see that the elemental quality, the environmental quality of the Earth of a previous stage becomes the spiritual quality of the human beings in the next stage. So, when the Earth was just warmth and then it changed into air and warmth, that warmth then became part of like our spiritual nature. And then when it became water, air, and warmth, the warmth in the air became part of our inner spiritual nature. And now, in the mineral stage, the Earth stage, the warmth, the air, and the water parts are part of our inner nature. They're part of our physical body. They're also the spiritual components of air, let's say, that the Hindus would call prana, is part of our inner spiritual nature. The spiritual nature of water, that fluidity of emotion, is part of our inner spiritual nature. And the inner nature of warmth, the spiritual nature of warmth, or what we would consider love and compassion, are part of our inner spiritual nature. So you can kind of hint like, okay, mineral nature then in the Jupiter stage, because mineral nature is our environment now, it will be part of our inner spiritual nature in the Jupiter stage. It's kind of difficult to imagine what that might be like, but that's how Steiner describes these things. So it's a little bit of a hint as to what the Jupiter stage might be like. Now, he gets a little bit more specific, these sort of cycles within cycles, as the Hindus would describe them. There's 7 major cycles of human evolution, and then each of those 7 major cycles has 7 cycles within it. So there's 7 minor cycles in every one of these 7 major cycles. He never described, well, he described in small part, in generalizations, what the minor cycles in the earlier stages of evolution were, but that wasn't as important as considering the 7 minor stages of Earth evolution, because, we have history books that can help us corroborate these things when we talk about just the Earth epoch, the current epoch of human evolution. So he calls these the Post-Atlantean Epochs, the 7 Post-Atlantean Epochs. So I guess if Atlantis collapsed and then the human race kind of had to reconstitute itself, now the 7 major cycles begin. So I guess he was hinting that Atlantis collapsed at the end of the moon phase, perhaps, or maybe the very beginning of the Earth phase of evolution. Probably the very beginning of the Earth phase of evolution is when Atlantis collapsed. And that started the minor cycles of the Earth phase. And there's 7 of them. He calls them the Indian phase of evolution, which was the first, then the Persian phase, then the Egypto-Chaldean phase, then the Greco-Latin phase, and then the modern phase, which began, he says, in the early 15th century. He said specifically the year 1413 is when the modern phase began that we are in now. And then there will be a 6th and 7th phase after that, which he has not named. And these phases are really interesting to think about, the way Steiner described them, because we have, our religious scriptures, our folk tales and mythology, the archaeological record, and the historical record to help us come to grips with what Steiner was talking about. And we can see that he actually did have a great deal of insight on the evolution of consciousness through these phases, through these minor cycles. And so I'll just briefly go through the 7 cycles and what they kind of are characterized by, and how our consciousness has evolved through this time period. In the Old Indian phase, it was categorized or characterized by the rishi, or the one who knows, kind of this clairvoyant shaman scientist sort of a person. And they had their clairvoyant faculties completely open at that time. Like every human being had this atavistic sense of clairvoyance, where everybody could see into the spiritual world and engage with these spiritual entities and spiritual realities, and it was very much a living part of our life. We did not have the perceptions we have today, which are only 5 sense materialistically oriented, or what you could call left brain oriented, as opposed to right brain oriented. You can consider the rishis as entirely right-brained oriented. So the difference between left and right-brained: the left brain is materialistic, smaller picture details. The right brain is a little more mystic, bigger picture kind of aspects. Then after that you have the Persian period, where our instinctual life was developed a little bit more, and we began to lose our clairvoyance just a little bit, and we began to see the physical world a little bit more in a defined way. The mineral world was more in our awareness than the spiritual world. The Indian rishis primarily dealt with the spiritual world and considered the material world to be an illusion. You'll have the ancient Indian teachings from the Vedic scriptures telling you that the world is illusion. To them, the spiritual world was more real. The spiritual world was more apparent to the Indians. And the material world was very nebulous and confusing and illusory to them. The Persians, a bit of the same, except the material world is a little bit more in focus to the Persians. And you can see this because they began like agriculture and building structures at this time. They built these big ziggurats. They started building cities like, Ur and Babylon. And so they were a bit more oriented toward the material world, but they still had a whole bunch of atavistic clairvoyance left over. And, they have these deep mythologies about the gods walking among them and whatnot. Perhaps they really did. Perhaps they actually saw the spiritual beings all around them all the time. Then the Egypto-Chaldean period followed the Persian period, where our emotional life was a bit more developed, or was developing rather. And we lost our clairvoyance a little bit more and became a little bit more materialistically oriented. And this is, characterized by the fact that we started establishing more of like a hardcore government. You started to have like pharaohs and stuff. And of course the pharaohs were still considered high priests with a deep spiritual connection. But the Persians were ruled by high priests. Their kings were high priests. They weren't really like governmental kings that we would think of today. They were the head of the religious order, and that's why they ruled. And the Indians were, of course, ruled by the rishis and the shamans. So the Egypto-Chaldeans, they started to create more earthly-style governments, started to codify laws, and became a bit more materialistic in that sense. And then we come to the Greco-Latin period. Of course, there are plenty of history books and written records and plenty of research available on the Greco-Latin period in a mundane sense. So a lot of what Steiner says can be corroborated. And during this period is when we really started, when the most the largest number of people lost their atavistic clairvoyant capability, and clairvoyance was in the hands of now the shaman or priestly type character. And most people were primarily engaged with the material world. This is, of course, shown by the huge scale warfare, conquering for the sake of empires, characterized by empire itself, which is clearly a materialistic, worldly governmental system. And while emperors and kings were interested in deification for themselves, that was not really their primary concern. Their primary concern was gaining wealth for their nations and spreading their borders to as large an area as possible. This is when Christ was crucified. This is at the fulcrum, the sort of middle point or the turning point of the 7 stages. It's the 4th stage, so it's like right in the middle. And Rudolf Steiner considers the what he calls the mystery of Golgotha, or the crucifixion of Christ, as the most important point in human history, in the development of consciousness and the development of the earth. And it's right at the fulcrum of the development in the current epoch. It was a huge turning point, and you can kind of see there's like a before that happened and an after that happened. And conveniently, our calendar, our modern mainstream calendar, is, labeled as such: before Christ and Anno Dominum. So the purpose of the mystery of Golgotha, that was basically to create a bridge back into the spiritual world as the world became very materialistic. There had to be a path available to human beings to re-engage their spiritual connection, re-engage their spiritual life, so that it wasn't lost completely. That's why Steiner believes that the episode of Christ is the most important point in human history, because we were rescued from an irrevocable drop into materialism, into materialistic perceptions. Because of Christ, we now have easy access back to the spiritual world. Whereas, before Christ, sure, lots of people had their clairvoyance, but they were reliant on, high priests and shamans and people like that to sort of get them in touch with the spiritual world. Or you had to join these mystery cults that would give you very difficult initiation rituals and practices that you had to dedicate your entire life to in order to have a spiritual connection. But after Christ, now anybody can have that spiritual connection. They say, in the New Testament, it says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And it's just this, it's like a more available path. It's, spirituality for the common man, spirituality for people who are mired down in materialism. And it would be way too difficult to do the old techniques of, you got to sit in a cave and meditate for 100,000 years until, you have like a Kundalini awakening and then become enlightened. And that is obviously not, that path is not available to modern people. You can't be expected to do things like that to have a spiritual connection. So Christ came to the earth to provide us with a shortcut, essentially, with an easier path. It's not an easy path, of course. It's very emotionally and intellectually difficult to take that path, but it is like, it doesn't require these strange techniques that are very difficult to accomplish. Then, in about the 15th century, we entered the modern period. And now our atavistic sense of clairvoyance at this point was like entirely cut off. Even the shamans hardly have a connection. Like pretty much nobody has a connection to the spiritual world anymore since the 15th century. It was the right brain finally fizzled out into being essentially dormant, and our left brain is very dominant right now. And a lot of people think this is like a terrible thing, oh gosh, we're so materialistic and we're dark and we're ignorant and all this sort of thing. And while they have a point, they also need to consider something else. in the past, when we had that atavistic sense of clairvoyance, where we could see the gods and the gods walked among us, so to speak, we were puppets. We had no free will because the gods basically controlled us. You know, if you see these incredibly powerful spiritual entities around you all the time, you have no chance. You won't defy them. You won't do anything that they don't want you to do. And this is shown in ancient folklore and mythology, especially regarding the Iliad and the Trojan War. You have Achilles, who was going to slay Agamemnon, and Agamemnon pleaded with him for various reasons not to kill him. And Achilles didn't kill him. But it is not because Achilles suddenly felt compassion and mercy and self-control. No, Achilles was going to kill him despite his pleas. It was Athena that came out of the spiritual world and grabbed his wrist and prevented the sword from falling. So, you know, that pretty much spells it out right there. We did not have free will. And we also did not have much of a sense of morality. Now, you could say, a lot of people say like, oh, the ancient Indians were so much more harmonious because they had a deeper connection with nature, you know, like when we were hunter-gatherers and all of that sort of thing, we were more spiritual and had a deeper connection with nature. While this is primarily true in a superficial sense, that deeper connection lacked, like I said, free will. It also lacked morality because you could actually see the interconnectedness of all life. That is why you did not murder people or damage the forest or whatever else, you know, the hippies hate happening in the world. It's because, like, you could see the world was part of yourself. Your neighbor was part of yourself. The tree is part of yourself. So it's like, I'm not going to cut off my own finger. That would be stupid. So, like, back then, with an atavistic sense of clairvoyance, it wasn't because of morality that people refrained from murdering each other. It was because they saw them as part of themselves. So I'm not going to kill you because that would be like damaging myself. So technically speaking, there was no such thing as morality or selfless behavior. Even though life was technically more harmonious, there was no morality or selfless behavior. If you do something selfless back then, it's because you knew you were going to receive a spiritual reward. This is why the rishis were so easy, why it was so easy for the rishis to teach about the laws of karma. Because you could just see that you would receive a spiritual reward for doing something nice and receive a spiritual punishment for doing something bad. You could readily see that. So people didn't do things nice because it was the right thing to do. They did nice things because they would get rewarded for it, because they saw the whole world as part of themselves. So that is not selfless behavior. That is like a sham. That is like false selfless behavior. That's actually, you could consider it selfish behavior. I'm going to do something nice for you because I'm going to get a reward for it. So in order for true free will and selfless behavior to exist, our clairvoyance had to be cut off, and we had to be essentially swallowed up by the material world, and we had to have like no connection with the spiritual world. So now people say, oh, it's scary, it's more disharmonious, there's pollution, industrial society, warfare, greed, and all this sort of stuff. And yeah, that is true, and that is a drawback of materialistic consciousness. But I'm going to perform a selfless action because it's the right thing to do. Not because I'm going to be rewarded for it. I don't know whether or not I'm going to be rewarded for it. I'm going to perform a selfless action because it is the right thing to do. And it might even come at a cost to me in my immediate life. If I give a beggar some money, I'm going to have less money. And that's actually like a cost. There's no benefit. In a materialistic sense, there's no benefit to helping other people. In fact, materialistic consciousness kind of has this Darwinistic dog-eat-dog, don't help other people because you will be better off. If I take a bullet for someone, I'm going to die. If you don't believe in the immortality of the spirit, if you sacrifice yourself for someone, you're just going to die, and that's not going to be good for you. So this inculcates a sense of true selflessness in people who are willing to take that bullet for someone else, and someone who is willing to bear the cost for the sake of a beggar. I don't expect a reward for doing something nice. I do it because it's just nice. It's just, it helps people, it helps society. And I don't care if I'm rewarded or not. That is selflessness. That is how you have to learn selflessness, is through materialistic consciousness. You can only be selfless if you don't have any spiritual awareness. And that will sound very contradictory, especially to the New Agers, but it is the fact. If you just sit there and think about it for a minute, you will realize that that is true. And it's also how we have to have free will. If we were slaves of the gods and we could see the gods, well, we had to close our minds from the gods in order to act freely. And people will say there's a lot of problems with that. Of course there are. It's not perfect, but it's the only way to learn free will. Now that we've spent 400, 600 years with materialistic consciousness, and we've had, the scientific revolution and all of that sort of thing, now it's time to start reawakening our right brain and re-spiritualizing our thoughts and our perceptions. We take what we learned through our materialistic consciousness and explorations, our free will and our truly moral and selfless behavior that hopefully many of us have developed over the last few centuries. And now we have to take that free will and moral behavior and regain our sort of clairvoyance. But now it will not be an atavistic clairvoyance where we are puppets and numbskulls, but it will be a true and individualistic clairvoyance where we have free will and can use our reason. And we can reason things through in a scientific manner instead of having revelations from the gods and angels and just being spoon-fed mystic knowledge and not coming to our own terms with it. So there's a big difference between reason and revelation. And Rudolf Steiner urges that the path of reason is superior to the path of revelation for various reasons. And I'll get into that in a future video. I'll have a whole video on the path of reason versus the path of revelation, how it regards mediumship, trance channelers, and automatic writing, and how that's all revelatory versus the more scientific approaches, which are reason-based. So you'll see after the fulcrum of the 7 cycles, this sort of U shape goes back up, and you have the modern era, and then the 6th and 7th era. And you'll see that the modern era is directly across from the Egypto-Chaldean period. It's because now after the fulcrum, which is sort of an age that stands on its own, these now 5th, 6th, and 7th periods will share some characterizations from the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st periods. So the modern period that we are in right now is kind of like a throwback to the Egypto-Chaldean period, where they developed their emotions a little bit. We're sort of dealing with our emotions again in this period of time. And we're also very interested in Egyptian culture. The occult societies of the last few centuries, especially since the 17th, 18th centuries, have been very interested in Egyptian culture. You have like Freemasons and the Golden Dawn, you have Napoleon Bonaparte, and just their obsession with Egyptian culture. They think like all religion and spirituality and all scientific knowledge comes from Egypt. This is of course ridiculous, but it is what these occult societies believe, or have believed. And so these 5th, 6th, and 7th periods will be throwbacks to each of the other ones. The 6th period will be a throwback to the Babylonian, Persian period. And you can see that beginning kind of in the 1970s with like Zecharia Sitchin and his interest in the Sumerian culture. And you have popular shows like Ancient Aliens, who they just can't stop talking about Sumerians and the Anunnaki and all of that sort of stuff. And you see that in the conspiracy theory research these days, is people are now a little less interested in Egypt, as we have been, and are more interested in Sumeria. And it also explains why archaeology became a discipline in this era, that like now we're digging through the past. It's the first stage, the modern stage is the first stage where we started to have this throwback to Egypt, these throwbacks to earlier time periods. And that explains the spiritual impulse that led to the discipline of archaeology, starting to literally dig through the past and be inspired by it. So the 6th and 7th periods, Steiner didn't really talk about them. He did say that whatever we create for the sake of good and beauty whatever we create for beauty and harmony will add to the good of the future, and everything we create for utility and selfish desires will add to the evil of the future epochs. Of course, a lot of people like to think of the movies The Matrix and The Terminator regarding this. We create machines for utility, and then they become part of the evil of the future, that they will actually overthrow us. Rudolf Steiner actually does talk about this. In 1908, he gave a series of lectures about what is called the electronic doppelganger, and that this electronic doppelganger that we will create, he says our industrial technologies that we've been creating will eventually take on life of their own, and depending on whether they're made for beauty and harmony or made for utility, will determine whether or not they will become our friends or enemies when they do take on life of their own. He said this in 1908. I'll have a video on that. I'll have a video on artificial intelligence and machine technology, and it will have a lot to do with Rudolf Steiner's teachings, but for now I'd like to just mention it to get you prepared for that. So that'll wrap up the cycles of history. That'll conclude this video. That is a general overview of the evolution of consciousness, as it is largely agreed upon in esoteric circles, and this is how it was taught by Rudolf Steiner in the beginning of the 20th century through his lecture series and books that he published. I'll end the video by sharing with you his books that this research was from. He has an outline of esoteric science, How to Know Higher Worlds, which will teach you basically the techniques and thought processes you can use to help develop your clairvoyant capabilities. My favorite book ever, Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. Again, more practical exercises on how to develop your perceptions, how to, if you have physical organs of sense, you can imagine soul organs of spiritual sense that we have to actually develop. We were born with our physical organs, but our spiritual organs need to be developed through practice and effort and conscious will. And then The Evolution of Consciousness is the last book of his that I'll recommend in this video, and that's kind of the bulk of what I was talking about today. The different stages of earthly evolution and all of that, and the cycles of the minor cycles that we went through. So thank you for tuning in. Once again, the show is called Esoteric Literacy, where we will hopefully increase your literacy in all things strange. I'll have plenty of videos in the future, so please check back, subscribe, keep looking back for updates on this channel. I think you'll find them very interesting, especially if you're into the weirder side, more paranormal, parapsychological side of life. You should be relatively stimulated by my research. I've been researching things like UFOs and esoteric science since I was like 4 or 5 years old. I'm not even kidding. So it's been like 25 years I've been doing this. And I would very much like to share what I've discovered with you all. And hopefully this will lead to more scientific investigation. This will lead to deeper spiritual connection with the religious institutions that you belong to. I'm not trying to change the way you think. I'm not trying to have you turn your back on academia or religion. I'm just trying to enrich your thinking about academia and religion. And hopefully you'll have a better appreciation for your religious institution. And I'm not trying to turn you off from it. So I wish you all the best. Have a good morning, afternoon, night, whatever time it is, and I'll see you next time.